Oh, hi, weirdos. Fatima here was just helping me prepare for today's discussion. I was running some of the plots of San Shui's short stories by her so I could just get my thoughts in order. So then they're like walking through this graveyard on an invisible bridge, and they hear strange noises like a river flowing and a clock going off, and the guy keeps talking about he has this beautiful grapes at his cottage. You know, that was really helpful. Thank you so much. San Shui is an experimental author from China's southern Hunan province. She's been writing since the early 80s, but her works in English translation have just started garnering major awards buzz in the last 4 years or so. Her 2015 novel, The Last Lover, won the Best Translated Book Award, and her latest novel, Love in the New Millennium, was longlisted for the 2019 Man Booker International Prize. But for all the critical acclaim, it can be difficult to get a sense of why these highfalutin muckety-mucks all consider San Shui to be essential reading. A lot of vague descriptors get thrown around in online descriptions of her work: surreal, darkly humorous, uncanny, plotless, philosophical. Fortunately, those are all qualities that I tend to love in literature. So I was finally sufficiently tempted to give her work a try. With very little sense of what I was actually getting into, I followed the advice of writer Kelly Crumry and picked up Dialogues in Paradise, a collection of short stories and San Shui's first work to be translated into English all the way back in 1989. It comes with a foreword by the author, a biographical sketch of her life growing up in rural China, and an afterword by one of the translators. These provide some really helpful context for trying to grapple with San Shui's whole artistic process and philosophy. And well, having read these stories, I can definitely see why people have had such a hard time talking about them. As with poetry, I felt like so much of the power of these narratives comes out in the reading process itself. For a few magic moments, you're channeling these intense images and emotions, and later, at random times, you notice them still rattling around somewhere in the back of your consciousness. You almost feel haunted by the text, though somehow no better equipped to explain how it happened or why it feels so enjoyable. Maybe that sounds like some new age mystical BS to you. It kind of did to me as I was saying it. So in an attempt to give this review a bit more of a concrete focus, I'm going to look at 3 types of readers who seem most likely to vibe with San Shui's long, strange literary trip. Number 1, lovers of domestic drama. By her own accounts, San Shui had a very difficult upbringing. In 1957, when she was just 4 years old, her parents were labeled by the government as ultra-rightists. They lost their job, their housing, and were eventually forced to move their entire family of 9 into a tiny remote hut at the foot of a mountain. With her parents and older siblings being sent off at various times for re-education through labor, there was very little stability in her household. The family members left behind were frequently on the verge of starvation. So she did what she had to do. Quit school at 11, got jobs as a metal worker and factory laborer, got married, had a kid. Eventually, she and her husband were able to start operating a tailoring business out of their home, which finally gave San Shui a little bit of breathing room to focus on her own goals and ambitions. She describes it like this in the foreword to Dialogues in Paradise. All of a sudden, I was 30. 10 years of youth had slipped by in a struggle. I believe that I have something to say about those 10 years and about the future. What I have to say is something beyond ordinary consciousness, beyond ordinary talk. I want to say it in the form of literature and imagination. Something abstract, emotional condenses itself in me. I started writing, wrote a little bit every day without any consciousness as to why to put it this way or that way, other than to stick to my own paradise, to ponder repeatedly, and to enjoy myself. It's kind of fun to think about San Shui sitting at home on an average afternoon, her son doing his homework while she spins out these bizarro fantasias for freaks like me across the world. And home life, particularly the hectic, overcrowded kind that she experienced growing up, is a major component of the stories collected in Dialogues in Paradise. Relatives are tramping in and out of the house at all hours. Living quarters get shuffled and reshuffled. People's strange little habits are constantly driving their family members nuts, like an obsessive need to keep rearranging all the contents of the various drawers, or just casually observing on how all of their relatives have excessively sweaty feet. If you like family soap operas, pent-up resentments, explosions of emotion, this is basically that distilled down to its essence. A bunch of these stories almost read like really disjointed plot synopses for a gothic potboiler. Think of all the most intense moments of Fall of the House of Usher or Wuthering Heights smashed together and fired out of a confetti cannon. If you, like me, are a messy bitch who lives for drama, these stories will hook you up with a hyper-concentrated dose. Ideal audience number 2, those who dig sensory stimulation. To the extent that there is a plot in San Shui's short stories, it doesn't come with a lot of forward momentum. Characters tend to get caught up in loops of compulsive, repetitive behavior. Stories tend to either gradually fade out during one of these iterations, or get cut off abruptly by some sudden violent outburst. One protagonist, whose mother somehow keeps nagging him despite having been transformed into a pile of dirty soap bubbles, ends up rushing out into the street and biting a total stranger on the shoulder. You know, that sort of thing. What you do get is a lot of sensory detail. This constant accumulation of colors, textures, temperatures, stank-ass smells, until you start to kind of lose track of who it is that's supposed to be feeling what. The entire scene is transformed into this kind of giant, throbbing sensory organ. This passage from the story Hut on the Mountain, I think, is a really good illustration of what I'm talking about. White lights are swaying back and forth everywhere. I clutched my mother's shoulder with one hand. Everything is so glaring that my eyes blear from the pain. You simply can't see a thing. But as soon as I return to my room, sit down in my armchair, put my hands on my knees, I can see the fir bark roof clearly. The image seems very close. In fact, every one of us must have seen it. Really, there's somebody squatting inside. He's got 2 big purple pouches under his eyes, too, because he stays up all night. Father said, "Every time you dig by the well and hit stone with a screeching sound, you make Mother and me feel as if we're hanging in mid-air. We shudder at the sound and kick with bare feet, but we can't reach the ground." To avoid my eyes, he turned his face toward the window, the panes of which were thickly speckled with fly droppings. Scenes like this are sort of the San Shui equivalent of a killer cliffhanger, a spike to all of your senses that almost compels you to keep reading. Apparently, Susan Sontag was also a huge fan of San Shui, which is funny because those explosions of sensory data in the passage I just read, and my own difficulty trying to pin down why they should feel so satisfying to me, they reminded me of Sontag's famous essay, Against Interpretation. In it, she laments the fact that so much of art criticism, especially in the literary sphere, is devoted to trying to decode some kind of hidden message that's supposed to lie beneath every great work. When that's your mission as a critic, surface-level details, things that our eyes can see and our bodies can touch, are easy to dismiss as so much pretty wrapping paper for the deeper meaning. Disposable. Of course, anyone who loves literature that makes their heart pound, that gives them goosebumps, that turns them on, those readers already know that all this is actually essential to the entire literary experience. Sontag concludes her essay by suggesting that critics need to start pulling their heads out of their collective asses and start developing a better vocabulary for talking about the body. She says, "What is important now is to recover our senses. We must learn to see more, to hear more, to feel more. Our task is not to find the maximum amount of content in a work of art, much less to squeeze more content out of the work than is already there. Our task is to cut back content so we can see the thing at all. The aim of all commentary on art now should be to make works of art, and by analogy our own experience, more rather than less real to us. In place of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art." So yeah, while San Shui's stories might not ever lead us to a clear conclusion or lesson, they do offer up an entire treasure trove full of weird feelings. If you like art that sets a mood, or draws your attention towards lots of intricate little details, San Shui has got you covered. Ideal San Shui reader number 3, people who love to participate. There's something about San Shui's writing that makes you feel like the book is almost waiting for you to do something, other than read the words on the page, I mean. There are all these gaps and lulls and repetitions. The mind kind of starts to wander. This guy keeps talking about his grapes. Bet they're going to be weird. I touched a heap of something soft and wet that felt like the entrails of some animal. It had a sour stench. I jumped up and shrieked. Called it. And I really feel like Tan Shui did this on purpose, leaving space for me to develop my own ongoing commentary track, to pile my own random imaginings on top of the world that she'd created. Critic Eileen Miles describes a similar experience in her review of another Tan Shui novel for the Paris Review. Part of the difficulty of reading Love in the New Millennium was that I couldn't stop tweeting passages. To be a reader was to become a trailer, and to become an actor, too. It's irresistible, the way one enters this laughable, shifting no time where everyone inside is talking about, like, the weather. It's also very boring, as a plotless book is. A circling, non-building narrative gets tiring. What's the pleasure, then? Humor and surprise. It's a frankly poetic existence. Plus, my reader's sense of awe grew continually at the endless refillability of the thing. The book is a vase. It's a form. So, Tan Shui's work is demanding in a kind of non-typical way. It wants you to play with it, like a book of surrealist Mad Libs. If you'd rather just sit back and have your books whisk you away to a world of adventure, you probably won't feel like Dialogues in Paradise is quite pulling its weight. But if you want to insert yourself into the story and put your own twist on what you're reading, you'll find plenty of room to do that. So for style, scope, and overall weirdness, I give Dialogues in Paradise 12 storms a-blowin', 11 strange lights glowin', 10 feet a-drippin', 9 visions gripping, 8 home invaders, 7 sleepless evenings, 6 pointless journeys, 5 family feuds, 4 phantom birds, 3 dead trees, 2 poison snakes, and a flower that I smelled in a dream. As a reading experience, this was really so unprecedented for me that I didn't feel like the traditional 5-star metric was even applicable here. Tan Shui's fiction offers many gifts, some of which might not be to your particular tastes, but for those readers who like this sort of thing, they're going to find more of it in a single story than they know what to do with. Next steps. Next steps. This is where we talk about recommendations. Tan Shui's fiction has helped your feeble human mind overcome its narrow conceptions of reality. Now you're looking for another good read to plunge you Inception-like into a dream within a dream within a dream. Here are a few suggestions that might just get you there. If you want to be in awe of another author with Olympic-level stamina when it comes to weirdness in their work, I recommend Member by Michael Sisko. This is an author who I first encountered in the Weird anthology, and the editors even introduced his work as being among the weirdest of the weird in the weird. Not knowing really where to start again, I grabbed this one because the cover art is just so cool. It's a story of a man who, wandering down the road one evening, sees a man collapse, and he picks up this man's bag and somehow becomes sucked into this cosmic game that's going on. His role within the game is never clearly defined. He goes from a setting that seems very close to our real world into some strange fantasy land that's almost like a mashup of Franz Kafka and Dr. Seuss. Workers toiling endlessly to perfect a giant device or structure of some kind. It's completely unrelenting with its random callbacks to earlier characters that seemed utterly inconsequential, and then they have a magical moment near the end where they'll reappear and seem to be very important. There's a glossary of terms at the back of the book that is clearly just teasing you with the idea that you'd somehow be able to understand any large portion of what's going on. It's just a lot. So if you're in the mood for another fairly overwhelming read, you should definitely check it out. Next, if you want another surreal domestic drama that loops and loops and loops before collapsing into some kind of giant mangled mess, I highly recommend Ice by Anna Kavan. When this was republished recently, it was billed as one of those lost classics of fantasy and science fiction. It tells the story of an extreme love-hate relationship that plays out in the middle of a climatological apocalypse. The world is freezing over, nation-states are competing to monopolize as many resources as possible. The couple at the center of the story initially meets under what seems like somewhat realistic circumstances. Whenever this couple is together, they can't seem to refrain from emotionally abusing one another, particularly the male protagonist. And yet, whenever they flee to the other ends of the world to get away from each other, they're immediately drawn back together through some cosmic yearning. There's a very touching scene that involves lemurs for some reason. So if you like a lot of that extreme interpersonal drama, but don't need so much realistic context to be getting in the way, you should definitely check this one out. So that's about all I have to talk about today. Have you read any San Shui? What did you think? What are some books you've enjoyed because you felt like they were really challenging you? Who are some of the authors that you know, if they can just find their right audience, those people are going to love them? Please let me know in the comments down below. As always, I will love you even more if you like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, happy reading, weirdos.